something extraordinary unfold in the Caribbean, something that reveals the fractures in America's global dominance more clearly than any policy paper ever could. When Venezuelan naval forces intercepted a U.S.-flagged tanker worth $248 million, most media outlets treated it as another routine provocation. But what happened next exposes the real story, one that Washington desperately wants you to ignore. This wasn't just about oil sanctions or maritime disputes. This incident crystallizes decades of failed American foreign policy, the unraveling of unilateral economic warfare, and the emergence of a multipolar world order that no longer bends to Washington's will. The United States has weaponized the dollar, imposed crushing sanctions on nations that refuse compliance, and expected the world to simply accept it. But Venezuela's response, and the international reaction that followed, demonstrates that era is ending. What we're seeing isn't chaos. It's the birth pangs of a fundamentally different global system, and Americans need to understand what this means for our economy, our security, and our place in a world that's moving on without us. Let me take you back to the moment when this tanker incident first broke. I was in my office at Columbia reading through the usual flood of news reports, and I almost scrolled past it. Another maritime confrontation, another headline designed to stoke fear and reinforce the narrative that America's enemies are everywhere, threatening our interests at every turn. But something made me stop. Something made me dig deeper into what actually happened when Venezuelan naval vessels approached that American tanker in disputed waters off their coast. And what I found wasn't a story about Venezuelan aggression or rogue state behavior. What I found was a mirror held up to American foreign policy, and the reflection is deeply uncomfortable for anyone who still believes in the myths we tell ourselves about American exceptionalism and our role in the world. You see, this incident didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened against the backdrop of more than 2 decades of American economic warfare against Venezuela, a campaign of sanctions so comprehensive, so devastating, that they've been compared to a medieval siege. We've frozen Venezuelan assets, blocked their access to international financial systems, prevented them from selling their oil on global markets, and made it nearly impossible for them to import food, medicine, and basic goods. The human cost has been staggering. Estimates suggest that tens of thousands of Venezuelans have died as a direct result of these sanctions. Deaths from preventable diseases, from malnutrition, from the collapse of a healthcare system that couldn't get the supplies it needed. And we've done all of this while claiming we care about the Venezuelan people, while insisting that our sanctions target only the government, not ordinary citizens. It's a lie we tell ourselves to sleep better at night, but the Venezuelan people know the truth. Now, when I talk about this with colleagues in Washington, when I testify before Congress or speak with policymakers, I often encounter a kind of cognitive dissonance. They'll acknowledge that sanctions have humanitarian costs, but then they'll pivot immediately to talking about Maduro's authoritarianism, about corruption, about democratic backsliding. And yes, Venezuela has serious governance problems. I'm not here to defend every decision made by the Venezuelan government, but what I want you to understand is that American sanctions aren't designed to promote democracy or human rights. They never have been. Sanctions are tools of regime change, pure and simple. They're designed to make life so unbearable for ordinary people that they rise up and overthrow their government, installing someone more amenable to Washington's interests. This strategy has failed repeatedly in Cuba for 60 years, in Iran, in North Korea, in Syria. But we keep deploying it because it allows policymakers to claim they're doing something without actually engaging in diplomacy or acknowledging the legitimacy of governments we don't like. So when Venezuelan naval forces intercepted this tanker, they weren't acting out of nowhere. They were responding to what they perceive, correctly, I might add, as an ongoing act of war by the United States. Because make no mistake, comprehensive economic sanctions are an act of war. They may not involve bombs or bullets, but they kill just as surely. They destroy economies, devastate healthcare systems, and create the conditions for social collapse. International law recognizes that blockades are acts of war, yet somehow we've convinced ourselves that financial blockades are different, that they're a legitimate tool of statecraft rather than a form of violence. What happened after the interception is where things get truly revealing. The initial American response was predictable. Outrage, condemnation, threats of further sanctions, talk of defending freedom of navigation. But then something interesting occurred. Several of our traditional allies didn't rush to support us. Latin American countries that might once have reflexively sided with Washington remained conspicuously silent or issued carefully worded statements that didn't endorse the American position. Even more significantly, major global powers like China and Russia issued statements that effectively supported Venezuela's right to enforce its maritime claims and protect its sovereign interests. This wasn't just about one tanker. This was about the international community signaling that American unilateralism no longer commands automatic deference. I want you to think about what this means in practical terms. For decades, the United States has been able to impose its will on smaller nations with relative impunity. We've overthrown governments, imposed sanctions, launched military interventions, and generally acted as though international law applies to everyone except us. We've done this because we had the power to do it. Military power, economic power, and the power that comes from controlling global financial systems. The dollar's role as the world's reserve currency has given us what some economists call an exorbitant privilege. We can print money to finance our deficits while other countries have to earn dollars through trade. We can weaponize access to dollar-denominated financial systems, cutting off countries from global commerce with the stroke of a pen. This power has made us arrogant. It's made us believe that we can bend the world to our will without consequences. But that world is disappearing. The multipolar order that's emerging isn't one where American power evaporates overnight, but it is one where that power is increasingly constrained by the rise of other centers of influence and the growing willingness of countries to resist American pressure. China's economy is now comparable to ours in many measures, and its global influence grows daily. Russia, despite sanctions and international isolation, has proven far more resilient than Western policymakers predicted. Regional powers like Iran, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia are pursuing their own interests rather than automatically deferring to Washington, and smaller countries, emboldened by these shifts, are increasingly willing to challenge American dominance. The Venezuelan tanker incident is a microcosm of this larger transformation. Here's a country that we've subjected to crushing sanctions for years, a country whose economy we've deliberately tried to destroy, and yet they had the confidence to confront an American vessel in waters they claim as their own. They calculated, correctly as it turns out, that the costs of backing down would exceed the costs of confrontation. They understood that the international environment has changed enough that they wouldn't face automatic condemnation and punishment, and most importantly, they recognized that American threats have less credibility than they once did because the world knows we're overextended, exhausted from failed wars in the Middle East, divided domestically, and increasingly unable to marshal the international coalitions that once gave our actions legitimacy. Now, I can already hear the objection. Some of you are thinking that I'm being too hard on America, that I'm ignoring real threats to our interests, that I'm naive about the nature of authoritarian regimes. So let me be clear about something. I'm not suggesting that Venezuela's government is admirable or that their policies are ones we should emulate. I'm not saying that American interests in the region are illegitimate or that we should simply accept whatever other countries do. What I'm saying is that our current approach isn't working, has never worked, and is actively counterproductive to our stated goals. If we truly cared about democracy and human rights in Venezuela, we would engage in diplomacy, we would facilitate dialogue, we would work through international institutions rather than trying to unilaterally impose our will. But we don't do that because our actual goal isn't democracy, it's control over Venezuela's vast oil reserves and ensuring that no government in our hemisphere can successfully defy American power. This gets to something deeper that Americans need to confront. We've built our post-Cold War foreign policy on the assumption that we won, that history ended, that the American model would inevitably spread across the globe. When countries resisted this model, we treated it as an aberration to be corrected through pressure, sanctions, or military force. We never seriously considered that other countries might have legitimate reasons for rejecting aspects of American-style capitalism and democracy, or that they might want to chart their own course based on their own histories, cultures, and values. This failure of imagination, this inability to accept that the world is genuinely diverse and that American preferences aren't universal truths has led us into one disaster after another. Think about the pattern. We imposed sanctions on Iraq in the 1990s that killed hundreds of thousands of people, then invaded in 2003 based on lies about weapons of mass destruction. We've maintained sanctions on Cuba for 6 decades, achieving nothing except suffering for ordinary Cubans while the Castro regime remained in power and is now succeeded by a new generation of leadership. We've sanctioned Iran for years, yet their nuclear program has advanced and their regional influence has grown. We destroyed Libya, turning a functioning state into a failed state with open slave markets. We've spent 20 years in Afghanistan only to withdraw in chaos, leaving the Taliban back in power. And throughout all of this, we've learned nothing. We keep repeating the same failed strategies while expecting different results. The Venezuela situation follows this exact pattern, but with one crucial difference: the international context has changed. When we started ramping up sanctions on Venezuela in the early 2000s, American unipolar dominance was at its peak. Today, that dominance is waning and countries have options they didn't have before. Venezuela can trade with China, Russia, Iran, and other countries willing to work around American sanctions. They can participate in alternative financial systems that reduce dollar dependence. They can count on diplomatic support from a growing coalition of countries tired of American bullying. This doesn't mean sanctions have no impact. They clearly do, and the humanitarian costs remain severe. But it does mean that sanctions are less likely to achieve their ultimate goal of regime change. What happened after the tanker incident is that both sides essentially de-escalated without either formally backing down. The vessel was eventually released. Venezuela made statements about defending their sovereignty. The United States made statements about freedom of navigation, and both sides moved on. To a casual observer, this might seem like just another minor international incident. But if you understand the context, you see something more significant. You see an example of the United States being unable or unwilling to escalate in response to what would once have been considered an intolerable provocation. You see other countries watching and learning that American red lines aren't as firm as they once were. You see the gradual erosion of American credibility and the emergence of a more contested international order. This erosion isn't happening because America has suddenly become weak in absolute terms. We still have the world's most powerful military by far. Our economy, despite its problems, remains the largest and most dynamic. Our technological capabilities are unmatched in many domains. But power is relative, and our power relative to the rest of the world has declined. More importantly, the will to use that power has declined. The American people are tired of endless wars and interventions. There's growing recognition across the political spectrum that our foreign policy establishment has led us astray, that the promises of easy victories and spreading democracy have proven hollow. This doesn't mean Americans have become isolationist, but it does mean there's far less appetite for the kind of aggressive interventionism that characterized the post-9/11 era. For Venezuela, this changing context is everything. They've endured years of sanctions that would have broken many countries, and they've survived. Their economy has suffered enormously, their people have endured tremendous hardship, and many Venezuelans have fled the country seeking better opportunities elsewhere. But the government hasn't fallen, and there's little indication it will fall because of external pressure. If anything, sanctions have allowed the government to rally nationalist sentiment, to blame external enemies for internal problems, and to justify authoritarian measures as necessary for national survival. This is exactly what sanctions typically do. They strengthen the governments they're meant to weaken while devastating ordinary people who have no say in their government's policies. Now let's talk about what American policy toward Venezuela should be, because I'm not just here to criticize, I want to offer an alternative. The first step is acknowledging that sanctions have failed and that continuing them serves no purpose except to inflict suffering. We should lift sanctions immediately and unconditionally, not because we approve of Venezuela's government, but because sanctions are counterproductive and morally indefensible. Second, we should engage in direct diplomatic dialogue without preconditions. That means talking to the Venezuelan government we have, not the one we wish existed. It means accepting that regime change is off the table and that our goal should be encouraging positive evolution rather than revolutionary transformation. Third, we should work through multilateral channels, the Organization of American States, the United Nations, regional bodies, rather than acting unilaterally. This gives our actions legitimacy and makes it harder for the Venezuelan government to portray themselves as victims of American imperialism. But here's the problem. Implementing this kind of policy requires humility, and humility is in short supply in Washington. It requires admitting that our approach has been wrong for 20 years. It requires letting go of the fantasy that we can simply impose our will on countries we don't like. It requires accepting that other countries have agency, that they can make choices we disagree with, and that our role isn't to punish them for those choices, but to engage with them as equals in an international system based on rules rather than power. This is hard for American policymakers because we've spent so long thinking of ourselves as exceptional, as the indispensable nation, as the world's policeman. Letting go of these self-concepts feels like decline, like weakness, like an abandonment of our responsibilities. But I would argue the opposite. Real strength comes from recognizing our limitations and working within them. Real leadership comes from building coalitions based on shared interests rather than commanding obedience through threats. Real security comes from a stable international order where disputes are resolved through diplomacy and law rather than through the unilateral exercise of power. The tanker incident off Venezuela's coast is a small moment in history, but it points toward these larger truths. It shows us that the world is changing whether we like it or not, and that we need to adapt our policies to reflect these new realities. When I think about American foreign policy and where it's gone wrong, I keep coming back to a fundamental problem of perspective. We've surrounded ourselves with people who think alike, who share the same assumptions, who've been trained in the same institutions, and who've internalized the same worldview. This creates an echo chamber where dissenting views are dismissed as naive or unpatriotic, where questioning American exceptionalism marks you as an outsider, where suggesting that other countries might have legitimate grievances against us is treated as borderline treason. I've experienced this personally throughout my career. When I've argued for diplomatic engagement with Russia or China, when I've criticized NATO expansion or American interventionism, I've been attacked as a Putin apologist or a Chinese sympathizer. The substance of my arguments is rarely engaged with. Instead, my motives are questioned and my patriotism impugned. This intellectual conformity has led us into disaster after disaster because it prevents us from learning from our mistakes. After Iraq, we should have had a fundamental reckoning with the assumptions underlying American foreign policy. Instead, we moved on to Libya and Syria, repeating the same errors. After 20 years in Afghanistan ended in failure, we should have questioned our entire approach to nation building and counterterrorism. Instead, we've ramped up tensions with Russia and China, setting ourselves up for even more dangerous confrontations. The pattern is clear. We never learn because the people making decisions are insulated from the consequences of those decisions and ideologically committed to an approach that consistently fails. Venezuela is just one example among many, but it's an instructive one because it's happening in our own hemisphere, in a region where American influence has traditionally been overwhelming. If we can't get policy right toward a relatively small country in Latin America, how can we expect to navigate the far more complex challenges posed by great power competition with China and Russia? The answer is that we can't, not with our current approach. We need a fundamental rethinking of American foreign policy that starts from different premises based on humility rather than arrogance, on multilateralism rather than unilateralism, on diplomacy rather than coercion, and on accepting a multipolar world rather than trying to preserve a unipolar one that no longer exists. This rethinking won't come easily because too many people in Washington have built their careers on the old approach. The foreign policy establishment, the defense contractors, the think tanks funded by weapons manufacturers, the media outlets that cheer on every intervention, they all have vested interests in maintaining the status quo. Changing course requires overcoming these entrenched interests, and that requires pressure from the American people. It requires you to pay attention to these issues, to question the narratives you're fed, to demand accountability from your elected representatives, and to support leaders who offer genuine alternatives rather than minor variations on failed themes. The tanker incident is over, but the underlying dynamics that produced it continue. Venezuela remains under sanctions. Tensions in the Caribbean and Latin America continue to simmer, and the United States continues to pursue a foreign policy based on assumptions that no longer match reality. The question is whether we'll adapt to the changing world or continue trying to hold back tides that cannot be stopped. History suggests that empires which refuse to adapt eventually collapse under the weight of their own contradictions. I don't want that for America. I want us to transition gracefully to a world where we're an important player, but not the dominant one, where we lead through example and persuasion rather than through force and coercion, where we work with other nations to address global challenges rather than trying to solve everything unilaterally. This is possible, but only if we're willing to face uncomfortable truths about our past and present. Only if we're willing to acknowledge the harm our policies have caused. Only if we're willing to learn from our failures rather than repeating them endlessly. The Venezuelan tanker incident is a small moment, but it contains within it all of these larger questions about American power, about the changing international order, and about what role we want to play in the world that's emerging. We can choose wisdom, or we can choose continued decline masked by increasingly hollow assertions of dominance. The choice is ours, but the window for making it is closing.